Somewhere right now, someone is sitting in a coffee shop with a laptop that doesn't have an Apple logo on the lid, and 6 months ago that would have been unthinkable to them. Not because they couldn't afford a Mac. They could. Not because they didn't love their Mac. They did, for years. But something changed, and they made a decision they haven't told most of their friends about yet. Everyone's talking about Windows users fleeing to Linux right now, and honestly, that story writes itself. Microsoft set a deadline, drew a hard line around which machines qualify for the next version of Windows, and basically shoved a huge chunk of its user base toward the exit. Cause and effect. Easy to understand, easy to report on. But there's a second migration happening at the same time, and almost nobody's covering it, because it doesn't have a press release attached to it. It doesn't have a deadline. Nobody forced it. It's Mac users, and not the casual ones who bought a MacBook because it photographed well next to a latte. I'm talking about the serious ones. Developers who chose Apple Silicon because it was supposed to be the best development hardware on the planet. Designers who defended their platform choice in arguments for a decade. Writers who paid full price, happily, because they believed they were buying into something better. They're leaving, quietly. And the fact that they're doing it quietly is almost as interesting as the fact that they're doing it at all, because in the communities these people belong to, admitting you've moved off Apple still comes with a social cost that Windows users never had to worry about. Nobody raises an eyebrow when a Windows user switches distros. Say you left your Mac for Linux in the wrong group chat, and people start asking if you're okay. So let's actually talk about why this is happening. Not the tired arguments about Linux being free or Apple being expensive, because those two facts have been true for 20 years and people kept buying Macs. Let's rewind to the moment that changed everything, because you can't tell this story without starting there. Late 2020, Apple releases the M1 chip, and the reaction is not hype, it's genuine shock. Performance. Years earlier came running back. The M1, then the M2, then the M3. This was Apple at the absolute peak of what it does best. For 2 or 3 years, the case for staying on a Mac had never been stronger. And then, somewhere around the M2 and M3 generation, something started happening that no benchmark chart ever showed. The hardware kept getting faster. The software around it kept getting worse. Not in one dramatic headline-making moment. Menus designed to steer you toward Apple's services business rather than actually serve you. iCloud creeping deeper into the operating system in ways that got harder and harder to fully switch off. And underneath all of it, a slow, patient, relentless push toward macOS subscriptions. Not just iCloud storage anymore, but individual features inside individual apps. Capabilities that used to be a one-time purchase quietly rebuilt as a recurring charge, because recurring revenue is what shareholders reward. And at the end of the day, Apple answers to Wall Street the same as any other public company. Developers noticed first, and that makes sense, because developers live in the gap between what a system promises and what it actually delivers, and they feel every inch of that gap. Apple Silicon was sold as the architecture that would make the Mac the best development machine ever built, and in raw speed, sure, it delivered. But the friction around it never fully went away. Rosetta 2, the translation layer that lets old Intel software run on the new ARM chips, is a genuinely brilliant piece of engineering. But needing it at all, not knowing whether a tool you depend on will behave the same way or run slower on native hardware, introduces a kind of uncertainty that just didn't exist before. Docker on Apple Silicon spent close to 2 years running noticeably worse than it did on a regular PC. Certain development tools had their ARM versions trailing months behind the Intel builds. Even running a virtual machine for testing, something that used to be simple on Intel Macs, turned into a more complicated story than it needed to be. And then there's the argument that keeps getting louder, no matter how many benchmark charts try to bury it. Every M-series Mac has soldered RAM. Soldered storage, nothing inside is upgradable. Nothing is repairable without going through Apple. On Apple's terms, at Apple's prices. A MacBook Pro with 16 gigabytes of memory is a fundamentally different machine from one with 32 gigabytes. And you have to make that call the day you buy it, because it's the only chance you'll ever get. This was always somewhat true of Apple laptops, but the M-series took it further, because now the memory isn't just soldered to the board. It's worth saying that Linux users have complained about soldered components for years. That's nothing new. What's different about this particular wave of Mac switchers is that they're not upset about repairability as some kind of principle. They're upset about what it actually means for them in practice, which is that Apple's business model quietly forces them onto a replacement schedule that Apple controls, not one they choose for themselves. And once a fully spec'd MacBook Pro creeps past $3,000, $4,000, even $5,000 depending on configuration, the question of whether the ecosystem is actually worth that premium stops being rhetorical. For a growing number of people, the honest answer is no, it isn't. So where are they actually going, and what are they finding when they get there? Because the Linux that exists in 2026 is not the Linux that existed even 3 years ago, and the difference isn't small. Start with the hardware, because this is where the story genuinely surprises people. Framework has become something close to a symbol for a specific kind of computer user, someone who wants serious hardware they actually own, fully, in the way ownership used to mean something. Modular ports you swap yourself. Replaceable RAM and storage. A company that publishes its own repair guides and sells you the spare parts directly instead of routing you through an appointment and a bill. A framework laptop running Linux is a machine you can upgrade in 3 years when storage gets cheaper, fix yourself the day something breaks, and realistically, keep running for a decade without depending on anyone's service program or repair calendar. That's a fundamentally different relationship with your own hardware than anything Apple offers. And for people who've spent years on Apple's upgrade treadmill, it genuinely feels like exhaling for the first time. Framework isn't the whole story either. ThinkPads have had rock-solid Linux compatibility for decades, and the newest generation runs it with essentially zero friction. Dell's XPS line works well. System 76 builds machines specifically for Linux and ships it pre-installed, no fighting required. Lenovo's entire professional lineup plays nicely too. The hardware landscape for Linux right now is deeper and more mature than it's ever been in its history. Drivers just work. Sleep and wake just work. Plugging in an external monitor just works. That old story, buy a Linux laptop and spend the first weekend wrestling with drivers, is turning into something people tell as a memory from a decade ago, not a warning about today. And a lot of Mac switchers are genuinely stunned by this because their mental image of Linux was frozen in 2012 and nobody had bothered updating it since. Then there's the desktop itself, and this is where most Mac users land more comfortably than they expect to. Two environments dominate the conversation: GNOME and KDE Plasma. GNOME's whole design language. The clean top bar, the overview you swipe into, the uncluttered visual approach maps onto the general feel of macOS closely enough that the switch stops feeling like a leap and starts feeling like a lateral move. KDE Plasma pulls in the users who want more direct control, more customization, more knobs to turn until every detail matches exactly how they want to work. Both of these have reached a level of polish in 2026 that would have seemed almost impossible 5 years ago. Fonts render beautifully. High-resolution displays behave correctly. Multiple monitors just work without a dance of trial and error. The visual gap between a well-configured Linux desktop and macOS has narrowed to the point where, on most days for most tasks, it's essentially closed. For creative professionals, a huge chunk of the traditional Mac audience, the software landscape, has shifted just as dramatically. Figma has lived in the browser for years now and behaves identically whether you're on macOS or Linux. The entire wave of web-based creative tools that's been quietly replacing native apps for a decade, Canva, Adobe's browser tools, every kind of collaborative design platform, all of it runs perfectly in Chrome or Firefox on Linux, no compromise required. Blender, increasingly, central to professional 3D and visual work, has been native Linux software since the day it was born. DaVinci Resolve, which a lot of video professionals consider the best editing software on the market at any price, has a full native Linux build. Kdenlive and Shotcut cover video editing for people with lighter needs. The old argument that serious creative work requires Mac OS, which was genuinely true in 2010 and mostly true in 2015, gets harder to defend every year. By 2026, the actual list of professional creative tasks that require macOS, rather than simply running fine on it, has shrunk down to a small handful of specific niche applications. Developers have it even better, and there's a bit of irony here because Apple's own transition chaos actually helped speed this along. When Apple Silicon introduced uncertainty into development toolchains, plenty of tool maintainers responded by shoring up their Linux support as a hedge against exactly that kind of instability. When Docker's rocky first years on ARM made containerized development on Mac unreliable, Linux quietly became the stable, documented alternative that teams leaned on instead. And when Windows added a full Linux subsystem that developers embraced enthusiastically rather than dealing with native Windows tooling, it confirmed something Linux people had been saying for years, which is that developers want Linux, and they'll go pretty far out of their way to get it if they have to. Native Linux just removes the workaround entirely. The terminal is the actual system, not an emulation layer bolted onto something else. The package manager handles everything consistently, no exceptions. Your development environment and your production environment are the same kind of system, which quietly eliminates an entire category of "it works on my machine" problems that have haunted developers for as long as the profession has existed. There's also something happening here that's harder to put a number on, but impossible to separate from the technical side of the story, and it's cultural. Apple built its entire brand around a specific identity: the creative, the independent thinker, the person who refuses to settle for ordinary, and for a long time that identity meant something real. because the Mac genuinely was a better creative tool, the design genuinely was more considered, and the operating system genuinely did respect your time and intelligence more than the alternatives did. But the company that built that reputation has become something different. A services company that happens to also make hardware. A company whose most profitable products generate recurring revenue and whose growth strategy leans on deepening its grip on existing customers rather than simply building better computers. The people who were drawn to Apple for the idea of it, who bought in because they believed in what it represented, are now noticing that the thing they believed in has changed shape, and that what's keeping them there increasingly feels like inertia rather than conviction. And this is where Linux offers something that sounds almost contradictory for an operating system, which is authenticity. Nobody building GNOME or KDE is optimizing for a stock price. The decisions that shape those desktops are made by people who use them themselves, who care about the details for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with revenue. When a distribution ships a new feature or makes a design call, it's because somebody genuinely thought it would make the experience better, not because it feeds a subscription funnel or locks you deeper into a services ecosystem. That difference in privacy is another piece of this, and it's a genuinely complicated one for Apple, because Apple markets itself hard as the privacy-first alternative to Google and Meta. In some ways, fair enough. End-to-end encryption on iMessage, real tracking prevention baked into Safari, the nutrition label-style privacy disclosures in the App Store. But Apple also collects a meaningful amount of data about how you actually use your device, and the newest wave of on-device AI features processes your personal information in ways that are genuinely difficult to fully audit or opt out of. On Linux, particularly a privacy-respecting distribution like Fedora, Debian, or Linux Mint, without telemetry baked in, the answer to what is this system quietly sending about me is nothing, unless you specifically configured it to send something. That's a level of clarity neither Apple nor Microsoft can honestly claim to offer. Now, let's be honest about the other side of this, because pretending there's no real trade-off would undercut everything else I've said. iMessage is the single biggest point of friction, and it's worth saying plainly that Apple built it this way on purpose. The blue bubble culture, full resolution photo and video sharing, the seamless handoff between iPhone and Mac, none of it exists on Linux, and the workarounds are never quite as smooth as the real thing. If your social or professional world lives inside iMessage, stepping away from the Mac means accepting a genuinely worse messaging experience until enough of the people around you migrate to something like Signal or WhatsApp. For some people, that's a minor inconvenience. For others, it's a real barrier. The tight hardware integration Apple builds between iPhone and Mac, things like Handoff, AirDrop, Sidecar, Universal Control, simply doesn't exist on Linux. Tools like KDE Connect can cover parts of that gap, handling notifications, file transfers, and clipboard syncing between an Android phone and a Linux machine reasonably well. But that solution assumes you're carrying an Android phone. If you're keeping your iPhone while moving your laptop to Linux, you lose a layer of convenience that a lot of longtime Mac users have quietly built their entire daily workflow around. That's a real cost, and it deserves to be said out loud instead of glossed over. And for a specific slice of professionals, Logic Pro, Final Cut Pro, and a few other Apple-exclusive tools simply have no Linux equivalent that matches them feature for feature. If your entire workflow is built around one of those applications, Linux isn't a realistic daily driver for you right now, full stop. That's a small group in the grand scheme of the Mac user base, but for the people inside it, it's a hard wall, not a minor inconvenience. All that said, the number of people for whom these trade-offs are worth accepting has grown substantially, because Linux keeps improving, because Apple keeps finding new ways to be frustrating, and because the specific things Linux genuinely couldn't do in 2019 have steadily turned into things it handles just fine in 2026. The people making this move aren't doing it because Linux is perfect. They're doing it because the balance has shifted, because the premium they were paying for macOS has been buying them a smaller and smaller set of genuine, meaningful advantages, because the things that used to make a Mac irreplaceable have either been matched on Linux or stopped mattering as much, in a world where most of what people actually do for work happens inside a browser tab anyway. The pattern looks remarkably similar across the people who've actually made this jump. They run Linux off a USB drive for a few weeks alongside their Mac, just getting a feel for it before committing to anything. They identify the 2 or 3 things they're genuinely worried about losing. Usually iMessage, usually 1 or 2 specific applications, occasionally a piece of hardware they depend on, and they test each one deliberately instead of guessing. Most of the things they were worried about turn out to be non-issues. 1 or 2 need a workaround they're willing to live with, and 1 or 2 require an actual change in how they work, and they have to decide honestly whether the freedom on the other side is worth that change. Then they make the jump. And when you ask them 6 months later how it's going, the answer is almost always some version of the same sentence. I really should have done this sooner. That's really the heart of why this is a quiet migration and not a loud one. Apple users don't exist in isolation, they exist inside communities. Design communities, developer communities, creative circles, where the Mac itself functions as a kind of cultural signal, where that logo on the lid means something beyond the specs of the machine underneath it, where saying out loud that you switched to Linux still gets you a look, still invites the question of whether you've lost the plot a little. So people making this move tend to do it privately. They show up to the same coffee shop, open a framework laptop running a GNOME, and just work. No announcement, no thread, no debate. But ask them in private, away from the performance of it, and the whole story comes out. The frustration that built up slowly over years, the night they finally decided to actually try it. How much smoother the whole transition turned out to be than they expected. The genuine relief of stepping off a platform whose direction they'd quietly stopped trusting a long time ago. A slow accumulation of individual private decisions isn't going to trend anywhere. It's not a revolution, and it was never going to make headlines the way a corporate deadline does. But it's real, it's building, and it's being driven by something that lasts a lot longer than any single hardware requirement or support cutoff date. It's being driven by people who've simply decided that the computer they paid for should work for them, not the other way around. And in 2026, for a growing number of people who genuinely thought they'd be on a Mac for the rest of their lives, Linux has quietly become the place where that's finally true. That's the actual story underneath all of this, and it's a lot more interesting than another deadline-driven migration ever could be. If you've been turning this over in your own head for a while now and haven't quite admitted it to yourself yet, you probably already know exactly what comes next.